He should never have lived to see the dawn. A former Marine, battered and dazed, hung upside down over the jagged cliffs of Devil's Spine, the wind clawing at him like something alive. Beneath him stood 3 dogs that no one would have believed could act as one. A German shepherd with eyes sharp as forged steel, a Doberman built for speed, and a Rottweiler broad as a fortress. They didn't wait for a single command. They moved like the plan had been written in their bones by the Creator himself. No one knew how they'd found him. No one could say why they refused to leave. But this wasn't just a rescue. It was a fight for something far deeper than survival, a battle for loyalty, faith, and the kind of bond that darkness can't destroy. Before we start, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country below. And if you believe God still sends his angels on 4 legs, hit subscribe, because this story will stay with you long after the screen fades to black. The late summer sun over Silver Point, Colorado, poured molten gold across the broken ridges of the Devil's Spine. The air was razor sharp, carrying the scent of scorched pine and dry dust from the old trails. These weren't gentle hills. The mountains here rose like shattered spires, rust-colored cliffs that threw knife-edged shadows across the valley. A hawk circled high overhead, its cry lost to the wind. Every so often, the light caught a glint of quartz beneath boot and paw, a flash of white in the rough terrain. Jack Mercer moved with the steady, deliberate rhythm of a man who'd spent half his life walking through unforgiving country. 43 years old, 6 feet even, his build was solid yet lean, muscle sculpted by 2 decades in the U.S. Marine Corps and hardened by the years after. His dark hair was cropped short, streaked with silver that caught the sunlight. His face carried the weathered calm of someone who had seen too much, and his gray eyes, cold as river stone, never stopped moving, scanning every shadow, measuring every sound. There was a stillness about him. The kind born from years of patrols in places where one wrong move could end your life. Even in silence, he moved like a man who still heard the echo of marching boots in his head. Since leaving the Corps, Jack had settled just outside Silver Point, a small mountain town that didn't care much about who you'd been, as long as you kept to yourself. Close enough to the mountains to disappear, far enough from people to breathe. The disappearances had pulled him back into the wilderness. 3 hikers gone in the last 2 months, no tracks, no remains, no answers. The only company Jack trusted walked beside him now, 3 dogs as different as the landscape itself. At the front was Ranger, a 6-year-old German shepherd with a sable coat that shimmered between bronze and black as he moved. Tall, strong, and upright, he carried himself with quiet authority, ears forward, eyes alert. Ranger had been Jack's partner since his final deployment. A military search and rescue K-9, he had an uncanny instinct for danger, reading the shift of wind or the tremor of a branch before trouble ever showed itself. In every mission, official or not, Ranger was the unspoken leader, the one who set the pace for all the rest. To his left darted Vex, a 4-year-old Doberman, sleek, black and tan, with the sharp, restless energy of a coiled spring. Quick, clever, and unpredictable, Vex saw things others missed. His amber eyes scanned constantly, his paws light and precise. When Jack first took him in from a retired K-9 handler, Vex had tested every rule, every wall, every lock. But in the field, he was surgical, the kind of partner who could stop a threat before it got close. Trailing behind was Bruno, a 5-year-old Rottweiler, wide-headed, broad-shouldered, built like a tank. His coat glowed a deep mahogany, streaked with black along his spine. He didn't move fast, but he didn't have to. When Bruno planted himself between danger and his team, nothing passed. Jack had rescued him from neglect 2 years ago, a shell of a dog then, skittish and underfed. Time and the steady influence of Ranger had turned him into a wall of loyalty and muscle. The trail wound upward through sandstone, the heat radiating off the rock in shimmering waves. Jack slowed, unfolding his battered USGS map, the corners soft from use. Red ink marks dotted the surface, each marking the spot where someone had vanished. Every one dangerously close to the same canyon choke point. The wind shifted, hot and dry, funneling down from above. It carried the metallic sting of dust, and something else. Something off. Jack frowned, scanning the cliffs, but saw only sunlight and shadow. Ranger had stopped ahead, nose to the ground, tail stiff as iron. Jack joined him, following his gaze to the narrow slot canyon ahead, the Devil's Spine's most dangerous pass. The rock walls rose sheer on either side, polished smooth by centuries of rain and wind. It was a place Jack hated, too many blind corners, too few ways out. Vex slipped inside first, his lean form gliding through the narrow path. Bruno waited for Jack's signal before following. The air cooled immediately, shadows swallowing the sunlight. Their footsteps sounded soft and distant on the sand. Jack was halfway through the slot when something moved above him, too fast for wind, too deliberate for a bird. He looked up, just as a figure dropped from the ledge. The man, if he was a man, wore dark, dust-stained clothes that blended into the rock. A bandana hid his face, a weathered cap shadowed his eyes. Jack caught a flash of pale blue before something hard, the butt of a rifle or club, cracked against his temple. The world exploded into stars. He hit the ground, breath knocked out of him. Rough hands jerked his arms behind his back, rope biting deep into his wrists. Jack tried to fight through the haze, roll, kick, strike, but another blow landed in his ribs, and his body betrayed him. The attacker worked fast, looping the rope through a climbing harness, securing it to a piton hammer deep into the rock. Jack felt himself being dragged toward the ledge, his boots scraping helplessly across the stone. The drop was hundreds of feet, jagged cliffs and sunlit emptiness below. Then, the rope went taut. Jack hung upside down, blood rushing to his head, sunlight stabbing into his eyes. Each breath came shallow and ragged. Above, the stranger leaned over him for a heartbeat, eyes unreadable, then vanished into the rocks without a sound. Below, chaos erupted. Ranger lunged forward, snarling, his bark echoing off the canyon walls. Vex's voice was sharp, cutting the air. Bruno's growl rolled like thunder through the ground. A crack split the air, a small explosive. Pebbles and dust rained down, forcing the dogs back. Ranger held his ground, barking in defiance, but another blast sent a cascade of rock crashing down, cutting them off from Jack. His last clear sight before his vision swam was Ranger, planted in the sand, every muscle locked, his eyes fixed on Jack's swaying form. He didn't look away. Then the sunlight flared. The blood roared in Jack's ears. And the world went dark. The first sound that reached Jack Mercer was the wind, a high, sharp whistle slicing past his ears. Then came pain. A deep, pounding ache at the back of his skull that spread like fire down his neck. When his eyes fluttered open, the world made no sense. The canyon walls were above him, the sky was below, a dizzying, inverted view of jagged rock and endless air. It took him a few seconds to realize what was wrong. He was hanging upside down, suspended hundreds of feet over the canyon floor by a rope that dug into his wrists and ankles. The sun blazed mercilessly, baking the rock until the heat shimmered like water. Each sway of the line burned his skin raw where the coarse fibers bit deep. He turned his head just enough to see the rock face beside him. The rope looped up to a piton jammed into a narrow shelf overhead, solid at first glance, but Jack knew better. Years of experience told him the truth. The ledge was fractured. Thin cracks spiderwebbed through the sandstone, the kind that could split without warning. One wrong shift, and the anchor would snap. Below, the canyon floor blurred in heat and shadow. But movement caught his eye, flashes of black, brown, and tan weaving between boulders. The dogs. Ranger stood on a lower outcrop, tall and still, ears pointed toward him. Even from a distance, Jack saw the focus in those amber eyes, the same cold intelligence that had saved his life before. Behind him, Vex darted through the dust, nose low, tracking every scent. Bruno moved in slow, tense circles, his huge head swinging toward every sound that came from above. Ranger broke first. He stepped forward to the highest part of the lower ridge and scanned the cliffside. His eyes tracked upward, following a debris-strewn slope winding along the left. It was steep, littered with loose rock and twisted roots from juniper shrubs gripping the cliff. Dangerous, but it was the only route up. Ranger let out a sharp bark, one single note of command. Vex froze. Bruno lifted his head. It was the same sound Jack had heard in combat zones, a signal to regroup. Vex trotted to Ranger's side, restless energy trembling through his lean frame. His paws danced in the sand, ready to move. Bruno lumbered up behind them, slow but sure, his massive body ready to shield them from falling debris. Ranger sniffed the air, testing the shifting winds that funneled through the canyon. Then, with deliberate focus, he began the climb. The slope was worse than it looked. Loose shale shifted under each step, scattering down in rattling streams. Ranger adjusted his pace, cautious, balanced, checking every foothold before allowing the others to follow. Vex climbed next, quick, graceful, claws scraping rock. Bruno brought up the rear, his sheer weight sending small slides of gravel tumbling down, but he countered each one with patient strength. Halfway up, Ranger halted. He didn't look back at first, just stood there, tense and alert. Then his ears flicked toward the piton high above. Even from this angle, he could see what Jack saw, the cracked ledge, the rope sawing deeper into the stone with every sway. Jack felt a sick twist in his gut. If that ledge gave way, he'd be gone before the dogs could even react. Ranger barked again, short, high, warning. Vex froze mid-step. Bruno rumbled low in his chest. Then Ranger moved, climbing faster now, determination in every stride. His paws struck stone in a rhythm of survival, the same rhythm Jack once followed into fire. He reached a narrow ledge just below where Jack hung. He barked twice, then a third, drawn-out note, the signal for secure path. Move in. Vex and Bruno obeyed. The Doberman darted along the uneven ledge, while Bruno wedged himself into tight spaces, his strength turning obstacles into open ground. Together, they formed a living chain, silent, disciplined, unstoppable. Ranger's gaze shifted up to Jack. The shepherd tilted his head, studying distance and angle, the calculation playing in his eyes. Below, movement flickered at the canyon's far rim. A man, thin, wiry, stood watching from the opposite side. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed his face, mirrored sunglasses hid his eyes. His clothes were dusty, worn, and wrong for a casual hiker. When he noticed Jack watching, he tipped his hat once, and vanished behind a boulder. Jack's jaw tightened. Whoever had ambushed him wasn't working alone. Above, the piton gave a faint metallic groan, the brittle, warning sound of rock beginning to shift. Ranger heard it too. His ears snapped forward. He let out a single sharp bark, one Jack hadn't heard since his service days. It was a call for full commitment. Now. Ranger bounded toward a narrow gap between the stones, barely wide enough for Vex to slip through. He pressed his shoulder against the rock wall, dislodging a rain of pebbles that cascaded into the canyon. The sound was sharp, echoing like gunfire. The dogs had found their way to the top. Jack forced himself to stay still. One wrong move could shake the piton loose. The sun slid behind a passing cloud, cooling the air. In that brief shadow, Jack saw Ranger more clearly, solid and steady, framed against the stone like a soldier awaiting orders. The German shepherd climbed higher. Dust clung to his sable coat, streaking it pale, but he didn't slow. His eyes never left Jack. Vex followed, bounding lightly from ledge to ledge, his sleek frame twisting with perfect precision. Bruno climbed last, every motion deliberate, his strength anchoring the team. Jack could hear them now, claws scraping, paws hitting rock, faint grunts of effort carried up on the wind. They were coming for him. He turned his head slightly, pain flaring through his neck, listening. Then he heard it, Ranger's low growl. Not a threat, but a promise. The same sound that had carried him through cold nights overseas, when fear crept too close, and that deep rumble reminded him he wasn't alone. A gust of wind blew dust into his eyes. He blinked rapidly, stinging tears cutting through the grime. Then, another sound. Faint, deliberate, boots crunching over loose gravel. The hair on Jack's neck rose. The attacker was still nearby. Far below, Ranger froze, nostrils flaring. A scent reached him, sharp and metallic. Gunpowder. Not fresh, but recent. Someone had fired a weapon not long ago. The shepherd's tail stiffened, lips curling just enough to flash his teeth. Without waiting, he surged forward. Vex followed, ears pinned back. Bruno lumbered close behind, the shale groaning under his weight. They reached a tight passage, the path narrowing to barely the width of Ranger's body. He crouched low, testing the rock's give before squeezing through. Vex slid after him like smoke. Bruno forced his way in, grunting as the stone scraped against his sides. A sudden noise made Ranger's ears twitch, a scrape above them. He looked up, and froze. A dark silhouette moved along the ledge, shoving against something massive. A boulder. Balanced on a crumbling shelf. Ranger barked once, sharp and loud, enough to make the canyon tremble. A heartbeat later, the boulder broke free. The sound was thunder. Stone grinding against stone, rolling into an avalanche of destruction. Vex froze, but Ranger slammed into him, knocking the Doberman clear. The boulder crashed down, exploding into shards. Splinters of rock flew like knives. One tore across Ranger's flank, slicing through fur and skin. The shepherd gasped, a sharp, quick sound of pain, but didn't stop. Blood streaked his left shoulder crimson. Bruno stepped forward instantly, his broad body shielding the others as debris clattered around them. His deep growl echoed off the canyon walls, a living wall of defiance. The attacker was gone again, melted into the rocks like a ghost. Jack's vision blurred from the sun and sweat, but he had seen it, the way Ranger threw himself into danger without a second's hesitation. Just as he'd done years ago, in some foreign desert, taking the hit meant for his handler. The path was clearer now, the falling boulder had carved a rough route upward. Ranger limped, but pressed on, his focus unbroken. Jack's chest tightened. Relief. Fear. Pride. They were almost there. Ranger stopped once more, glancing back at his teammates. A low chuff passed between them, a wordless signal. Then, all three turned upward again. Above them, the rope creaked, the faint, deadly whisper of fibers ready to snap. Jack held his breath. The shepherd moved forward. Closer. Closer still. The cliff rose before him, pale, sunburned stone streaked with shadow. Heat shimmered in the air, distorting the edges of the world. Ranger's injured shoulder bled freely now, a dark stain on his coat, but he climbed anyway, slow, methodical, fearless. His eyes locked on the frayed rope that held his handler's life. From here, he could see the piton clearly, a cracked spur of rock no wider than a wrist, the rope cutting deeper with every sway. Another gust of wind. Another groan of shifting stone. Ranger lowered his head and began to calculate. Ranger stood on the narrow ledge, muscles tight, eyes fixed on the rope that held Jack suspended over the void. The piton wedged into the sandstone trembled with each gust of wind, the fibers of the rope creaking like an old ship under strain. Vex scrambled up beside him, panting, his tongue lolling briefly as he scanned the heights. His sleek, black and tan coat gleamed with sweat and dust. The Doberman tilted his head toward the rope, then back toward Ranger, as if waiting for an order. Bruno arrived seconds later, slow, steady, his massive paws dislodging small stones that rattled into the canyon below. His deep chest rose and fell in rhythmic heaves, every breath controlled, deliberate. He looked from Jack to the rope, then to Ranger, his loyalty written in his posture. The shepherd studied the anchor point again, a spur of rock barely thicker than his forearm, cracked and crumbling around the edges. The rope had already cut a groove into it, sawing deeper with every sway. Ranger knew that one strong gust could shear it clean off. He glanced down the cliffside. About 30 feet below lay a patch of loose sand and rock, framed by scattered shrubs. It wasn't soft, but it wasn't stone either. It could work, if they made it ready. Ranger turned, meeting Vex's eyes, and gave a short, clipped bark. Instantly, the Doberman understood. He leapt down to the lower ledge and began to dig, claws tearing into the dry soil, sending up clouds of dust. Each stroke widened the patch, loosening it, shaping it into something that might cushion a fall. Bruno joined him, grunting softly as he used his sheer bulk to push loose dirt into the hollow Vex was making. Together, they worked fast, silent but purposeful, not panicked, just focused. This wasn't instinct anymore. It was teamwork, honed through years of shared purpose. Above them, Jack hung motionless, his body swaying gently in the wind. Sweat stung his eyes, tracing thin rivers through the grime on his face. His wrists burned from the rough rope, the skin rubbed raw and bleeding. He could feel the heat radiating from the rock, smell the metallic tang of his own blood. He forced his breathing to steady, keeping his gaze locked on the dogs below. He had learned long ago, if Ranger was calm, there was still a plan. The shepherd lowered his head, nostrils flaring as he sniffed the rope. He tested the tension, gauging its strength, then shifted his paws and looked down again. The patch below was growing, wider, softer, now layered with a thin cover of dry leaves that Bruno had dragged in from a nearby bush. Ranger's tail flicked once, the signal. Almost ready. Jack's heart pounded. He understood what was coming. A faint rustle above drew Ranger's ears back. He froze, head tilting just slightly. A small desert packrat emerged from a crevice above, its dusty fur blending with the stone. It sniffed the air, blinked at the dogs below, and vanished again into the cracks. Ranger didn't move. His focus was absolute now. Vex barked once, short and sharp, signaling completion. The makeshift landing zone was as ready as it could be. Bruno gave a confirming huff, then positioned himself between the soft patch and the rock wall, as though preparing to break Jack's fall if the angle went wrong. Ranger turned back to the rope. His gaze flicked between the swaying line and Jack's inverted body, calculating the arc, the drop, the seconds it would take. His ears pricked forward once, twice. Then, without hesitation, he placed his front paws against the base of the rock spur. Jack tensed. "Easy, easy, boy," he whispered through gritted teeth, though he knew Ranger couldn't hear him over the wind. The shepherd bared his teeth, white canines flashing in the sun. He clamped his jaws around the rope. The fibers resisted at first, thick and coarse. He bit harder, muscles bunching in his neck and shoulders. The rope groaned, splintering. For a heartbeat, time seemed to hold its breath, then came the sharp, snapping sound. Jack dropped. The world flipped into chaos, sky, rock, and light spinning together in a blur. The wind roared past his ears. Then, impact. He hit the sand patch hard. The breath exploded from his lungs, pain flashing through his ribs and shoulder. But he was alive. The sand cushioned most of the fall. The bone-jarring shock ebbed into a throbbing ache instead of the final silence he'd braced for. For a few long seconds, he couldn't move. Just the ringing in his ears and the smell of dust and blood. Then, suddenly, movement. Vex was the first to reach him, darting in fast, whining softly as he pressed his head against Jack's chest. His eyes searched Jack's face as if demanding proof of life. Bruno lumbered in next, his massive head lowering to sniff at Jack's cheek before he turned to face the canyon, guarding. His presence alone was a wall between Jack and any threat that might still linger above. High on the ledge, Ranger stood motionless, his sides heaving, blood drying on his shoulder. He stared down at them for a long moment, not with hesitation, but with the quiet steadiness of a soldier confirming a mission success. Then he began to descend, careful and slow, his paws finding their way down the steep slope until he reached the canyon floor. Jack lay still for a while, feeling the grit press into his skin and the sun beating down. His lungs burned, his vision swam, but the rope was gone. The pain in his shoulder was sharp, but distant, dulled by adrenaline. He turned his head as Ranger approached. The shepherd's shadow fell across him. For a moment, it felt like the two of them were back in another lifetime, dusty deserts, the smell of cordite, the silence after a firefight. Trust wasn't something you spoke. It was something you lived. Jack raised his bound hands and touched the side of Ranger's neck. "Good boy," he rasped, voice hoarse. The shepherd leaned closer, pressing his head gently against Jack's arm. The wind funneled through the devil's spine again, colder now, whispering between the rocks. The canyon was empty except for them, 3 dogs and a man who had just cheated death by inches. As the light began to shift and the edges of the cliffs glowed orange, Jack managed to sit up, bracing against a boulder. His right arm hung limp at his side, pain throbbing from shoulder to elbow. Dislocated, maybe fractured. His shirt was torn, streaked with dirt and blood. Ranger immediately closed the space between them, sniffing at the wound before licking it clean, slow, methodical, careful. The touch burned at first, but Jack let him continue. He knew what the dog was doing, keeping the dirt out, controlling the bleeding. Bruno positioned himself against the wind, a living barrier that blocked the blowing dust. His thick coat ruffled under the gusts, his stance wide and protective. Vex, ever restless, began pacing a small circle around them, his head low, ears twitching at every distant sound. His sharp eyes darted toward the canyon walls, scanning, watching for movement. Jack reached for his canteen, hanging loosely from his belt. It was nearly empty. He took a single sip, the water warm and metallic, then tilted it toward Ranger. The shepherd lapped once and stepped back, letting the others take their share. When the last drop was gone, Jack looked toward the cliffs. The light was fading fast, and the shadows growing deep. "We need shelter," he muttered under his breath. Ranger's ears flicked. He turned toward a dark cleft in the rock a short distance away, little more than a crack at first glance, but wide enough to conceal them. He padded forward, sniffing the air, then looked back, tail low but steady. Jack followed, dragging his aching body across the sand. Inside, the space opened into a shallow cave carved by wind and time. The air was cooler, tinged with the scent of stone and earth. Bruno settled at the entrance, his body filling half the gap, while Vex stationed himself halfway between guard and scout, eyes locked on the canyon beyond. Ranger stayed closest to Jack, still alert, but calmer now. For a long moment, there was silence, not peace exactly, but the kind that sits between danger and relief. Then, on the wind, came a faint smell. Smoke. Not wood smoke from a campfire, something sharper, metallic, unnatural. Jack's eyes opened wider. "That's not lightning," he said quietly. "Someone's cooking up trouble." Ranger's head lifted, nose working. Vex froze, ears pricked. Far down the canyon, the crunch of footsteps echoed, slow, deliberate, too cautious to belong to an animal. Bruno's deep growl rolled through the cave, a warning. Ranger turned to Jack, amber eyes catching the dim light. No words were needed. They'd been here before, in alleys, ruins, deserts. The moment before a strike. Jack unclipped the small folding knife from his belt, flicking it open with his good hand. The blade caught the faint glow of the dying sun. His injured arm hung limp, but his mind sharpened. The footsteps drew closer. Ranger moved first, silent as a ghost, positioning himself just inside the shadows. Vex crouched low, muscles taut. Bruno didn't move at all, his bulk blocking the light from the cave mouth. The steps stopped. Silence pressed in, heavy, suffocating. Jack held his breath. Then came the faint metallic click of a gun's safety being released. Ranger's body stiffened, fur bristling. Outside, a shadow broke the last thread of sunlight. They weren't alone. Night had swallowed the canyon whole. The last threads of twilight were gone, leaving only a thin, pale moon hanging low above the jagged peaks of Silver Point. The wind howled through the devil's spine, cold and narrow, slipping between the rocks like a whispering spirit. Jack crouched near the mouth of the cave, his injured shoulder throbbing with each shallow breath. Dried blood crusted the side of his face, the copper taste of it still lingering at the back of his throat. His knife rested in his good hand, the metal glinting faintly in the blue-gray light. Ranger moved first, stepping into the open with the grace of something born from both discipline and instinct. Even in the darkness, his sable coat shimmered faintly, the lighter streaks along his shoulders catching the moonlight. His body was low, balanced, every muscle waiting for command. Vex slipped silently to the left, hugging the jagged rocks that rose along the canyon's edge. His lean body melted into the shadows, eyes reflecting small sparks of light as he maneuvered for position. Bruno took the right flank, slower, heavier, his movements precise, his weight distributed to silence his steps. Between them, they formed a triangle, boxing in whatever moved in the canyon below. The air smelled of smoke and oil, faint, but enough to make Jack's instinct scream danger. He peered over the edge of the cave's shadow and saw him. A man knelt near a fallen log at the base of the ridge, a battered canvas pack open beside him. He wasn't big, but his frame was wiry, the kind of strength built from endurance rather than power. His jacket was torn at the elbow, his jeans stained with dust and old blood. His hair, long and matted, clung to his forehead. He hummed under his breath, a low, tuneless sound, as he sorted through the pack. A coiled rope, a dented canteen, a folded tarp. And a knife strapped to his thigh. Jack watched him through the dimness, every sense sharpened by the silence. The man's posture told him everything he needed to know. Calm. Confident. Too calm for someone lost. This wasn't a hiker. This was the kind of man who didn't get lost, he made others disappear. Ranger froze mid-step, then lowered his head, lips pulling back just enough to expose a sliver of his teeth. The sound that followed wasn't a growl exactly, more like a low vibration that hummed through the rock itself. A warning. A promise. Jack's pulse quickened. He knew that sound. It was Ranger's signal, the one that meant move and you're done. Vex shifted silently along the left ridge, circling wide to cut off retreat. His paws moved over the rock as if the ground remembered his shape. Bruno mirrored the motion on the opposite side, his bulk fading into the deeper dark. Jack moved too, sliding along the inner wall of the canyon, using the jagged stone as cover. His breathing stayed measured. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Years of training resurfacing instinctively. Below, the man stiffened slightly, head tilting. He'd heard something, a shift of pebbles, maybe the wind. His hand drifted toward the knife strapped to his thigh. Ranger's eyes locked on that movement. His body tensed, one coiled line of power ready to strike. Jack whispered under his breath, "Easy, Ranger, wait." The man's fingers brushed the hilt. Ranger exploded from the shadows. He hit the ground like a bullet, silent until the last instant. His paws struck dirt with a muffled thud, and then his full weight slammed into the man's knife arm. The stranger cried out, the blade flashing once before Ranger's jaws clamped around his wrist. Bone and muscle shifted under that crushing grip. The man tried to twist free, but Ranger held firm, the deep rumble of a snarl rolling through the canyon. Vex appeared a heartbeat later, a black streak of motion from behind. He collided with the man's back, driving him forward into the dirt. Bruno charged in from the right, his heavy body knocking the man's legs out from under him with a force that cracked rock. The knife skidded across the ground. Jack descended fast, his boots sliding on the gravel as he reached them. He planted his foot on the attacker's free arm and snatched the knife up in one swift motion. The man thrashed once, wild-eyed, but Bruno's deep growl froze him. It was the kind of sound that told you, move, and I'll end it. Jack pressed the blade to the ground beside the man's head and exhaled slowly. You tried to hang me over a cliff, he said, voice low but steady. Now you're the one staying put. Ranger released the man's wrist only after Jack gave the signal. Blood smeared the man's sleeve where teeth had broken skin, but he didn't dare reach for it. Vex hovered close, his tail stiff, eyes flicking between Jack and Ranger. Bruno stood over the man's legs, chest rumbling with each controlled breath. Jack spotted the same rope from earlier, the one used to tie him. He grabbed it from the man's pack and began binding his wrists and ankles, his motions quick, practiced, and without sympathy. The cords bit deep into the man's skin, firm and unrelenting. You like ropes, huh? Jack muttered. Let's see how it feels from the other side. The man didn't answer. His jaw clenched tight, breath shallow. His eyes flicked toward the canyon wall, like he was listening for something. Ranger caught the motion instantly, ears swiveling. He turned his head toward the darkness beyond, scanning, listening. His tail lowered, body still but ready. Jack noticed too. You're not alone, are you? He said quietly. No answer, just a faint twitch at the corner of the man's mouth. The silence around them deepened. Even the wind seemed to pause. Ranger's ears pivoted toward a faint sound, rock scraping against rock somewhere far down the canyon. Footsteps, maybe. Jack's jaw tightened. We're done here for now, he said, glancing down at Ranger. Let's find out if he brought friends. The shepherd's tail gave one measured sweep before he stepped aside, still watching the prisoner. Jack hauled the man upright by his bound arms and pushed him toward the nearest flat section of rock. Ranger and Bruno flanked him, silent and watchful, while Vex ranged ahead, nose sweeping low over the dirt. For now, the canyon was still. But the night didn't feel finished. There was something else out there, something waiting in the dark, watching their every move. Jack could feel it. The stars above Silver Point shimmered faintly through the thin veil of dust in the air, and the canyon wind shifted, bringing with it the faintest trace of gun oil and cold steel. They weren't safe yet. Not by a long shot. The first light of dawn crept across the peaks of Silver Point like a slow awakening. The razor edges of the cliffs softened under the pale gray glow, turning bloodstone ridges into quiet silhouettes. A thin chill rode the wind, brushing across the canyon and stinging the lungs with every breath. Jack Mercer moved carefully along the narrow trail, the prisoner's rope held firm in his good hand. His other arm remained strapped tight against his chest, his shoulder aching from the dislocation. Each step sent a dull throb of pain through his ribs, but he kept moving. There was no choice. Ranger led the way. His head was low, eyes sharp, nose close to the ground as he followed invisible paths written in scent and instinct. His sable coat was streaked with dried blood and dust from the night before, yet his movements were precise, measured, unbroken. Vex patrolled the left flank, close to the wall of the canyon. His sleek body hugged the shadows, amber eyes flicking constantly from the prisoner to the trail ahead. His tail was stiff, posture coiled with alert energy. Bruno stayed at the back, a silent enforcer. His deep chest rose and fell in steady rhythm, his broad frame looming just close enough to remind the bound man that there was nowhere to run. The prisoner stumbled often. The path through Devil's Spine was not made for the weak or the guilty. Narrow switchbacks twisted between walls of crumbling shale. The ground tilted toward the void with every curve, each step threatening to slide into open air. Jack's grip on the rope never loosened. Whenever the man lagged, Ranger's head would snap back, eyes hard and unblinking, and Bruno would rumble deep in his throat, a low, primal sound that made obedience seem like the only sane option. Halfway down the ridge, the air shifted again, colder now, thinner. The wind funneled upward, carrying with it the faint sound of movement below. Then, a voice. Calm, female, echoing faintly through the stone. "Hold up there." Jack turned, his knife still clipped at his belt, his good hand tightening instinctively on the rope. A woman was climbing toward them from a lower trail, olive green uniform blending with the brush, boots crunching over gravel. A park ranger, by the patch on her sleeve. Her hair, sun-bleached at the edges, was pulled into a knot at the base of her neck beneath a worn cap. She moved with the confidence of someone who knew every turn of this mountain by heart. When she reached them, her gaze swept over the group, Jack's torn clothing, the sling on his arm, the dirt and blood caked into his skin, and the 3 dogs surrounding him like a living perimeter. Her eyes settled finally on the man bound in rope. "Looks like I missed one hell of a night," she said, voice even but edged with curiosity. "More like one hell of an ambush," Jack replied, nodding toward the prisoner. "We're taking this one back to Silver Point. He's responsible for the disappearances up here." The ranger's brows lifted slightly. "Name's Callahan. Hazel Callahan. I've been tracking those missing hiker reports for months." She shifted her weight, her tone lowering. "You're saying this man caused all of it?" Jack gave a grim nod. "Tried to make me the next." Her gaze dropped briefly to Ranger, who stood silent beside Jack, alert but calm. A faint smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. "That's a good dog you've got there." "Not just good," Jack said quietly. "He's the reason I'm still walking." For a heartbeat, their eyes met, soldier and ranger, both understanding the price of survival in wild country. Hazel stepped aside, motioning down the path. "Stay on this route. The others twist back into deadfall. This one'll take you straight into town." Jack nodded once, then started forward again. Ranger took the lead, nose to the wind, testing every shift in air pressure. The descent was long, punishing. The shale underfoot slid with each step, and more than once Jack had to steady himself against the rock wall. Ranger guided their pace, steering them toward firmer footing when the slope turned treacherous. The prisoner tripped again near a switchback. Jack pulled the rope taut, jerking him upright. "On your feet," he muttered. The man sneered under his breath, but Bruno's growl silenced him before the sound could form into words. They continued downward, the canyon widening as they approached the lower valley. The light grew warmer, the sun climbing higher, spilling gold across the tops of the pines below. For the first time since the ambush, Jack allowed himself a slow breath. The trail ahead was safer now, wide enough to walk 2 abreast, the cliffs giving way to open hills. Ranger's ears twitched suddenly. He turned his head sharply toward the left ridge. Jack froze, following his gaze. Movement. Just a flicker, a shadow slipping behind the rocks. Vex growled low, a warning. Bruno stepped forward, muscles coiling. But when Jack peered again, the shadow was gone. Only the steady whisper of wind remained. "Keep moving," he murmured. Almost there. By the time they reached the base of the trail, the world had transformed. The cold grays of dawn had turned to warm golds. In the distance, Silver Point shimmered, a small cluster of buildings nestled between pines and redstone cliffs. The prisoner's pace quickened, but not from energy, from fear. The town meant exposure. Witnesses. Consequences. Ranger stayed close now, brushing Jack's leg with each step. Vex ranged ahead toward the first gravel road, scanning the perimeter. Bruno held formation at the rear, his presence a silent threat against escape. When they reached the edge of town, Jack slowed. The streets were still quiet, bathed in the soft light of early morning. Wooden storefronts lined the main road, a diner, a supply shop, and at the far end, a small brick building with a fading sign that read Silver Point Sheriff's Office. Jack pushed open the station door with his shoulder, the bell jingling above it. Behind the desk sat a stocky man in his 50s, his mustache thick and his coffee mug steaming. His badge gleamed faintly in the morning light. He looked up, then nearly dropped his cup. "Mercer," he said slowly. "Either you're bringing in the entertainment for the morning, or that's the man we've had bulletins out for." Jack tugged the prisoner forward. "He's the reason hikers kept disappearing in the spine. Tried to hang me over the canyon. My dogs made sure he failed." The officer's eyes flicked to Ranger, who sat tall and steady beside Jack, his gaze unwavering, his fur still streaked with dried blood. "Well, I'll be damned," the officer muttered. "We ought to pin a badge on that one." Jack gave a faint, tired smile. "Wouldn't argue with that." He handed over the rope and stepped back as the officer, Pete Garner, took custody of the man. While Garner called for backup, Jack explained everything: the ambush, the fall, the rescue. He spoke evenly, but never once downplayed the dog's part. The way Ranger had led, how Vex had flanked, how Bruno had guarded them through every turn. When Garner finally led the prisoner to a holding cell, the man cast one last look back at Jack and the dogs, a glare of pure frustration, maybe fear. Jack didn't return it. His attention was on Ranger, who now sat by his leg, head lifted, eyes soft but alert. The morning sunlight caught the faint gray along his muzzle. "You did good," Jack murmured, scratching gently behind his ear. "All of you did." Vex wagged once, sharp and quick. Bruno gave a low, satisfied chuff. Outside, the town was waking up. The diner door swung open, letting the smell of bacon and coffee drift through the air. The streets filled slowly with quiet conversation and the hum of a new day. Jack took a breath, deep, grounding, grateful. For now, they were safe. But somewhere in the back of his mind, a thought lingered: this wasn't the end. Just a pause between battles. Morning in Silver Point arrived with a rare kind of clarity, the sort that feels like the world itself had been washed clean overnight. The sky was a deep, endless blue, the air crisp but not cold, and the sunlight spilled down over the cobblestone square in golden sheets. The entire town had gathered. Rows of folding chairs filled the open plaza, their metal frames glinting in the sun. Families lined the sidewalks, children waving small paper flags, and the smell of fresh coffee and baked bread drifted from the diner across the street. The flagpole in the center gleamed, its brass cap catching the light. At the front of it all stood a simple wooden stage, draped with the red, white, and blue of the state banner. Jack Mercer stood to the side of that stage, his right arm still bound in a sturdy sling. His shirt was clean now, freshly pressed, though the faint scarring on his face and the stiffness in his movements spoke of wounds that hadn't yet healed. Beside him sat the three who had brought him home. Ranger at his right, tall, still, the sable fur along his shoulders brushed smooth to a shine. His amber eyes stayed fixed on the crowd, his posture disciplined as if this were another mission. Vex lay at Jack's feet, his sleek body coiled but relaxed, his tail giving the occasional twitch of alertness. Bruno remained closest to the edge of the stage, the silent sentinel, broad enough to block anyone from getting too close without permission. The crowd quieted as Mayor Richard Calloway took the podium. A stout man with a booming voice and the easy confidence of a lifelong local, he adjusted his gray suit jacket and cleared his throat. "Folks," he began, his words carrying easily through the speakers. "Today we gather not just to celebrate bravery on the battlefield, but the kind of courage that rises from the soul, the courage to act when no one's watching, when life itself hangs in the balance." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Calloway turned toward Jack, his smile proud and genuine. "Jack Mercer, you brought justice to our mountains. You've shown this town that heroes don't retire, they just find new fights to win. And as for your partners..." He looked down at the three dogs and chuckled softly. "Well, I reckon Silver Point's never had better citizens." The crowd laughed, warm and soft. Jack's gaze drifted across the faces gathered there, townsfolk, hikers, a few familiar locals. Near the back, he spotted Hazel Callahan, the park ranger who had met them on the trail, her hat in her hands. She gave him a small nod, pride flickering in her eyes. Beside the police station's door stood Officer Pete Garner, leaning against the frame with his ever-present coffee cup, though for once it was forgotten, in his hand. And near the front row sat a young boy with a cast on his arm, his mother's hands resting protectively on his shoulders. Both were watching the dogs with shining eyes, the boy's expression somewhere between awe and adoration. The mayor's voice drew Jack back. "Silver Point is proud to present this medal," Calloway said, opening a small velvet box. Inside, a silver disc gleamed in the sunlight, engraved with the town's crest, the outline of the mountains, crossed branches of pine, and the simple words, "Valor and Faith." The applause swelled as the mayor handed the box to Jack. Jack lifted the medal, its cool weight resting against his palm. For a moment, he just looked at it, then turned toward the crowd. His voice was steady, low but strong. "I accept this," he said, "on behalf of the real heroes." He gestured to the dogs. "Ranger. Vex. Bruno. Without them, I wouldn't be standing here. They didn't just save me, they worked together, they fought as one, and they never once hesitated. Ranger didn't wait for orders. He led. He's the reason I'm alive today." A soft wave of murmurs rolled through the audience, followed by clapping that grew into a standing ovation. Jack lowered himself carefully to one knee, ignoring the ache in his shoulder, and fastened the medal gently to the thick fur at Ranger's chest. The shepherd stayed perfectly still, head high, his eyes bright in the morning sun. For the briefest moment, it almost looked as if he understood. The crowd erupted, cheers, whistles, even tears from a few faces. Children shouted the dogs' names. Flashbulbs popped from cell phone cameras, capturing the moment forever. Jack smiled faintly, resting his hand on Ranger's neck. The shepherd turned his head slightly, leaning into the touch. For the first time in days, the air felt easy. After the ceremony, the crowd dispersed slowly, townsfolk stopping to pat Bruno's broad shoulders or scratch Vex behind the ears. Ranger tolerated the attention with quiet patience, his gaze always drifting back to Jack. By afternoon, the square had emptied, the stage dismantled, the medals still gleaming faintly against Ranger's fur. Jack had moved into a modest cedar-sided house on the edge of town, a small, weathered place where the paved road ended and the forest began. The backyard stretched toward the tree line, fenced and shaded by tall pines. Beyond that lay the wild expanse of the mountains, vast, silent, eternal. The four of them fell into rhythm quickly. Mornings were quiet. Jack worked with his hands again, repairing old furniture for the shop downtown, the smell of wood and varnish grounding him in the present. Vex spent most of his time patrolling the yard, chasing away anything smaller than a fox with theatrical enthusiasm. Bruno preferred the porch, stretched out in the shade, keeping an eye on the road like a guard who never took a day off. Ranger, though, was different. He often stood at the far edge of the property, gazing out toward the peaks. Still, silent, watchful, as if listening for something the others couldn't hear. Jack would sometimes join him there, standing shoulder to shoulder, watching the sun sink behind the ridges. "You miss it too, don't you?" he'd murmur. "The work. The danger. The purpose." Ranger would glance up at him, that same steady look that said more than words ever could. Peace had returned, at least for a while. But peace never lasts forever. One late afternoon, as clouds gathered over the valley and the air thickened with the scent of coming rain, a sound shattered the quiet. A long, piercing wail rolled through the trees, distant but unmistakable. A siren. It came from Camp Elridge, the old military outpost a few miles east, a sound Jack hadn't heard in years. He froze mid-step, every muscle in his body tightening. Across the yard, Ranger lifted his head, ears pricked forward, eyes blazing with focus. For a long heartbeat, they stared at each other, man and dog, both understanding before a word was spoken. Jack's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "Let's go, brother," he said quietly. Ranger's tail flicked once, sharp and certain. Vex was already pacing near the gate, energy sparking through his lean frame. Bruno rose from the porch, stretching his massive legs and shaking off the lazy comfort of the afternoon. And Ranger was already moving. The leader once more. Guiding them toward the trees, toward the mountains, toward whatever waited beyond. Sometimes, the greatest miracles don't come in lightning or thunder. They don't arrive as blinding signs or angelic voices from the clouds. Sometimes, they come quietly, in the shape of 4 paws, a steady gaze, and a loyalty that never falters. Jack Mercer had seen miracles before. He had seen men walk away from explosions, seen hope survive in places where even faith had gone quiet. But nothing compared to the moment he woke to find 3 dogs standing between him and death, guardians sent from somewhere far beyond his understanding. The mountains were calm again now. Silver Point slept beneath a golden sunset, its rooftops glowing like coins in the fading light. The chaos, the blood, the dust, all of it had become memory. Jack stood on his porch, one hand resting lightly on the wooden railing, his arms still stiff from the injury but healing. The world around him was painted in soft amber hues. The faint sound of wind through pine needles drifted through the evening air, and somewhere far off, a hawk cried as it circled above the ridges. Ranger sat beside him, tall and silent, his fur brushed clean, the faint scar on his shoulder hidden beneath a new layer of sable and black. Vex lounged near the steps, nose twitching at every shift of the breeze, while Bruno occupied his usual post by the gate, solid and patient, eyes half closed but mind awake. Jack didn't speak at first. He just watched the horizon. The mountains stood in the distance, eternal and unmoving, their outlines sharp against the bleeding sky. "It's funny," he said finally, his voice low, reflective. "When I was hanging up there, I thought that was it. I thought my story was done." Ranger turned his head slightly, amber eyes glinting in the fading light. "But it wasn't," Jack continued. "Turns out, God had other plans." The shepherd's tail thumped once, slow, deliberate, as if in agreement. Jack smiled faintly. "I've been through war zones, lost brothers, seen what fear can do to a man. But that day on the spine," he exhaled, shaking his head. "That was something else. That was faith showing up in a way I never expected." He glanced down at Ranger, at the steady, unwavering calm in the dog's gaze. "You 3, you didn't just save me. You reminded me that some bonds aren't built by man. They're given from above." Vex gave a soft, restless whine, eager, as always, for movement, while Bruno lifted his head at the sound, letting out a slow, rumbling breath that seemed to vibrate through the porch boards. The sky darkened to a deep violet. One by one, the stars began to show. Jack's thoughts drifted, to the cliffs, the rope, the sound of the wind, the way Ranger had bitten through the line without hesitation. He could still feel the snap, the fall, the rush of air. He could still see those eyes staring up at him from below, steady as stone, fearless as faith itself. He rested a hand on Ranger's neck. The dog leaned into it gently, a quiet acknowledgement that needed no words. "You were an angel that day," Jack murmured. "All of you were." For a moment, silence hung between them, not empty silence, but full. Alive. A breeze rolled down from the mountains, cool and sweet, carrying with it the scent of pine and distant rain. The trees rustled softly, and the last of the sunlight slipped behind the peaks. Jack took a slow breath, filling his lungs, letting it out with the ease of a man who finally understood something he'd been searching for all his life. In the distance, thunder rumbled once, not a storm, just a reminder. He looked toward the mountains again. "You know," he said quietly, "I think maybe God doesn't just send angels with wings." Ranger's ears perked slightly. "Sometimes," Jack continued, "he sends them with paws, and hearts that never question why. He sends them to remind us we're never really alone, even when we think we are." He smiled, the lines at the corners of his eyes deepening. "And if that isn't a miracle, I don't know what is." Behind him, The house was warm and simple, a fire burning low in the hearth, a worn jacket hanging by the door, a quiet life waiting. But Jack didn't move yet. He stayed there with them, with the only family that had followed him through both hell and grace. As darkness settled over Silver Point, the lights of the town flickered on, small, glowing windows scattered against the night. The sound of laughter drifted faintly from the diner, the world carrying on, unaware of the battle that had taken place in its shadow. Ranger stood now, lifting his head toward the wind as if listening to something unseen. Vex rose next, stretching long and lean before trotting toward the fence. Bruno got to his feet last, shaking himself once before padding over to stand beside Ranger. They were a silhouette now, three shapes against the dim glow of the horizon, quiet but powerful, guardians of a man who no longer needed saving, but still found comfort in their watch. Jack looked at them, at their strength, their peace, their purpose, and nodded once. "Thank you," he said softly. He knew they wouldn't answer. They didn't have to. The truth had already been spoken in every step they took up that mountain, in every risk, every breath shared between them. And maybe that's how God works, not in the thunder, but in the steady footsteps beside you when the road gets dark. Jack turned toward the door, his hand brushing the old wood. Then, for no reason he could name, he looked back once more. Ranger was still watching him. The moonlight caught in his eyes, turning them to gold. Jack smiled. "Come on, boys," he said quietly. "Let's go home." The three dogs moved as one, following him into the warm light of the house, the sound of their paws soft on the porch. Behind them, the wind carried across the valley, whispering through the pines and over the distant ridges of Devil's Spine, the place where death had tried to take him, and faith had taken its place instead. And somewhere in that stillness, between the trees and the starlight, it felt like heaven itself was watching, proud, and silent, and near. If this story has touched your heart, share it with someone who needs a reason to believe again. Because miracles don't always shout, sometimes, they just walk beside you. And if you believe that God still sends his angels, even the ones with fur and paws, leave an amen in the comments below. Until next time, may the Lord bless and protect you, and may you never walk alone.